Sarah Hall, please.
Thank you, Chair. Dan, I'm afraid it's back to you again. I'd like to just look at the subletting in residential lease agreements. So how common is it for leases to be allowed to, for leases to allow for income from subletting public-owned property not to be returned to the Crown Estate or the Treasury?
So I think what's important is to just lay out how these leases are set up and the transactions are set up. In the case of long-term leases beyond 21 years, and in the cases here above 50 years, we look at a number of things with regards to how we transact a lease: the state of the property, the repair requirements, whether an upfront premium or a rental is beneficial, the legislative environment, a whole host of things. And the properties in question we're talking about are over 20, 30, 40 years. And with each transaction, we go through a valuation process. We have that independently verified. We put it through our governance processes, and we inform Treasury. If, as part of that, subleasing is an element of the overall transaction, then that's part of the value for money equation. And coming back to your question, Sarah, that is reasonably common in the property industry, in particular when it comes to long leaseholds.
So in the case of Royal Lodge, why did the lease allow for the 3 cottages to be privately rented by Andrew Mountbatten Windsor rather than the Crown Estate leasing them and generating the income for the taxpayer?
Again, coming back to the transaction of a long leasehold, the governance process that led to the arrangements at Royal Lodge in 2003 was such that a whole range of things were looked at: the premium, the refurbishment needs that would have otherwise been a Crown Estate cost, and a whole host of other elements that I've just said I won't repeat. Within that, subleasing of the cottages was part of the independent valuation that informed both the consideration and the value for money requirements being satisfied.
Okay. And did the Crown Estate have any visibility or oversight over the rents that were charged for those properties?
No.
No. Why is that?
Well, that's a matter for the tenant.
And then the leases between Royal Lodge, Bagshot Park and the Thatched House Lodge, they contain materially different provisions on subletting. So why is that?
Well, again, the properties were done over different periods of time, and a range of factors. So every property is different. It's got a range of different needs, different costs. For example, in the case of Royal Lodge, the £7.5 million in refurbishment costs, we're able to then take that money that we would otherwise have to spend and invest in other things. By way of example, Thatched House, the same type of thing. So again, we look at a range of factors that go into what makes up the needs of a property, the opportunity around a property, and a whole host of other external factors. And at the time that these transactions were put in place, an independent valuation process was sought, factoring in those particular elements for that particular property at that particular time. And best value was determined by that independent valuation, and then obviously a negotiation and a transaction was had with the counterpart.
Right. So how do you monitor the income generating subletting arrangements on the properties? Does that happen, or?
In the case of long leaseholds, no, because the consideration for a number of cottages in the context of the overall transaction of something like a Royal Lodge, by way of example, but there are other examples we have across the portfolio, aren't large in the scheme of things. They're de minimis. And again, that was the key thing here, it was part of the original transaction. And those income streams, those potential income streams, were taken into account in determining what best value was at the time.
Okay. Does, in your opinion, does allowing leaseholders to retain subletting income constitute a public subsidy or financial benefit? And if not, why not?
We rely on the independent valuation process, and if you're valuing a property and a lease determines that another element goes up. They look at all of that in the range of a transaction, and so what it's not right to look at is subletting in isolation. It's looking at subletting in the context of an overall negotiation that included a lease premium up front, included refurbishment costs being taken on by the tenant, and then within the demise of the property, letting the tenant lease elements of it. But again, that was taken into consideration with regards to the overall consideration, and the independent valuation at the time determined that was best value.
And just one more question from me, Chair. So given that the Crown Estate doesn't collect or publish information on the receipts, how can Parliament and the Public Accounts Committee be assured that those arrangements represent value for money and are being managed transparently?
I think we've been very transparent in the 28th of November 2025 submission to the PAC. We were asked about a single property. In return, we've provided all the information we have on all those properties. What we've also done is and I think this is being documented quite heavily in the National Audit Office report, how we go about seeking governance and valuation on royal properties, and those processes being relatively consistent in demonstrating independent assessment from the requisite experts on what best value is at the time. So I think, again, we've provided all the information to that effect that demonstrates best value through the last 20 to 30 years.
Dan, can I come back on Sarah's questions? Because normally when somebody takes a lease on a property, you would expect that they would be taking it because they've got a particular use for themselves or their family or their employees. You wouldn't be expecting them to make a profit on it, because if you were, you'd be stipulating in the lease that you actually ought to give permission for subletting, and you'd want to be able to vet who was taking the sublease, because you'd want to know that they were going to be able to maintain the property. But in particular, if they were going to make a lot of money, particularly when the lease is so long and with inflation and discounting and so on, they could be making a lot of money at the end of the lease, which you can't necessarily bargain for when you let it. So isn't there a case for being much more circumspect in future when you let these type of properties about these subletting provisions? Again, there's a whole host of factors that we take into consideration when we look at contemporary leases. Like we have historically, given the statutory arrangements at the time, the regulation and where it sat at the time, leasehold reform legislation is one example of that. But again, if we look at leases moving forward, we will look at them in the context of what represents best value given the conditions of that particular property. And of course, we're not going to want a prospective tenant to make money in contradiction to what that particular lease was meant to do at the time. However, again, I don't want to comment, and I can't comment on specific circumstances historically, but what I can say is that the Crown Estate went through all the appropriate governance processes, with the questions that you're asking being checked by experts and determining what best value was at the time, and then those negotiations delivered that best value through the transactions that took place. Moving forward, we would not want there to be something new emerge that we hadn't thought of, but that there's nothing to say that has happened in the past. What we would ensure is that, again, we were meeting the same best value requirements as we've always had to meet and as we're obligated to meet, both through the Act and through my accounting officer responsibilities. I hear what you're